Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. This is Safe Capital of the World, and first of all, thank you for inviting me to come speak to you. My name is Brad Spurlock. I'm the manager of the Smith Library of Regional History and the Cummins Local History Room for Lane Libraries. And this is a pretty interesting program today on the history of the safe industry in both Cincinnati and Hamilton. So to start with, safes are a product of the Industrial Revolution. So this is a new product, a new industry that's developing. And why do we need safes? Basically, it's for two reasons. What's called the Yeggman, or the safe cracker or burglar, and because of fire. You have valuables that you want to protect. There's a lot of more money being made because of the industry and producing products and expanding commercial sales of products. And because of that, there's a need to protect all of the money that's around now. The first safe commercially produced was by the Chubb brothers. It was made in 1818 in England. There's a picture of it on the screen there. So here's your Yeggman. And even though these safes were meant to protect valuables, they were not always successful in doing that. Here's a couple pictures here of blown safes over the years. And then, as I said before, fire was the other real problem. And this is a time period before modern day fire prevention and firefighting technology. And basically the idea was just to have a box that would protect the valuables in the event that there was a fire, because it was unlikely that the fire was going to be able to be put out. And this is also at a time when causes for fire were a lot more commonplace, as you can see from the cartoon here. So what exactly are we talking about here when we're talking about the safe industry? We're talking about strong boxes. So this is an example of a strong box on the screen here. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a box that's strong. It's a hard to open box with locks. That evolves into the vault, or into the safe, which are the safes like we know today, and safes like you see around the corner or the perimeter of the room here. It also involves locks. Now, a lot of times locks have to be manufactured by other companies and installed in safes. So a lot of times the lock company and the safe manufacturing company are two separate companies. And that is especially true, here's another example of a lock. It's especially true for the time locks, which are highly intricate mechanisms, basically that will allow for a door to only be opened at a certain time or between a certain period of time. And then we're also talking about vaults. And this is basically, how do I turn an entire room into a safe? You build a concrete room or a brick room, and then you put a giant safe vault door on the front of it. And here's a couple pictures of some vault doors that were locally manufactured. Okay, so before we talk about the Hamilton safe industry, we have to talk about the Cincinnati safe industry. And here are some of the principal people that we'll be talking about. Some of these names you might recognize. Some of these names you will probably not recognize. But even though we're talking about the Cincinnati safe industry to start with, our story begins in Pittsburgh in 1843. In Pittsburgh, there was a guy named Edward Hall, and he was born on May the 20th of 1798 in Salem, New Jersey. And his son, Joseph Lloyd Hall, was also born in Salem, New Jersey, and the family relocated to Pittsburgh in 1832. Edward was unsuccessful in his business pursuits and actually sent his children into different trades, hoping that they would be successful. Joseph actually worked on a riverboat on the Mississippi River for a period of time as part of this. And In 1846, the family, well, Edward and Joseph, father and son, joined together to create a company that they called E&JL Hall in Pittsburgh. And this was a safe manufacturing company. They created the pattern 1849 safe, which became the standard design for a long period of time. And it's unique because it's fire resistant due to it being cement lined. The family relocated to Cincinnati in 1848, making E&J Hall the first of the many safe companies that would later operate in Cincinnati. And here's a picture of one of their strong boxes and a photo of, or a likeness of Joseph Lloyd Hall. Here's what the interior would look like. And there's one of their pattern 1849 safes. So the company became E. Hall and Company in 1850 and remained that until 1851. In 1851, Edward Hall retired, and his portion of the company went to another guy named William B. Dodds. And Dodds is an interesting individual. He's a shoemaker by training, but he had a lot of other careers as well. He was a cane tuck, which if anybody knows what that is, that's those who took flatboats down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers carrying cargo. He was a canal lock builder. He was a coal salesman. He was a farmer. And he was a failed steamboat builder and had only 12 months of formal schooling. He was a Pittsburgh native, but he moved around kind of between the Cincinnati and Louisville area. So the company becomes called Hall, Dodds and Company. And here's a couple of their advertisements that were picked up from local newspapers. And we're still making this pattern 1849 safe at this point. And they're manufacturing about 2 safes per week, and they have 15 employees. So remember that. You'll notice how much they expand in the coming slides here. Okay, so 1856, we don't really know why, but Hall and Dodds sever ties. The sources talking about the dissolution of that company were very factual in discussing what had happened, so we don't have a whole lot of insight into what happened, but there probably was some kind of falling out at some point. And that starts a succession of companies. Hall, Carroll and Company is a successor company to that. They're all kind of run by Joseph L. Hall. And eventually, we arrive at, in 1867, at the Hall Safe and Lock Company being founded. This grows to be the largest safe manufacturing company in the world. Here's some pictures. This is the outside of the factory complex. And here's an interior view of the safe manufacturing floor. And as the largest safe manufacturing company in the world at this point, Hall grows the company to include about 700 workers, and they're manufacturing about 60 safes per day. And here's some of their products that they created. And they're also selling safes all over the world at this point. All across the United States and overseas. This is a picture of one of their offices out west. Okay, so let's pause on Hall's company for a minute and let's step back and let's go to Charles Urban. So, Charles Urban, he's born in Germany about 1809. He is a blacksmith working in Cincinnati, 1839 to 1842. And in 1842, he begins manufacturing safes. So he basically just transitioned from doing blacksmith work to safe building specifically. He just started specializing in safe building. And his product was called the Salamander Safe. And you can see some advertisements for that on the screen here. And he had an interesting way of marketing his safes. He would take them out in the street. He would put contents on them, inside them, and he would set them on fire. And he would leave them to burn for about 9 hours. And after which he'd put the fire out and open the safe and show that the contents were unharmed on the inside of the safe. Several other safe manufacturers started copying this technique of advertising. But there was testimonial after testimonial that survives that shows that Charles Urban built high-quality safes. And there's many, many customers of his that were pleased with his work. His manufacturing operation rose to about 28 workers, manufacturing about 180 safes per year, so still a relatively smaller scale operation. However, he did increase that, and by 1850 he was manufacturing about 250 safes per year, all of them hand-built, and had about 16 employees who were paid about $1 per day on average. However, there's some issues that arise. In 1855, the wall one of the walls inside his manufacturing operation fell and actually killed one of his workers. And in 1856, he needed a new partner. And who he decided to partner with was none other than William Dodds, who had left Hall around the same time period. So they form Urban, Dodds and Company, also in Cincinnati. But after only 2 years, in 1858, Charles Urban died. So it just becomes called William B. Dodds and Company for a period of time, until he brings on a new partner, Neil Macneale. And you'll notice some of the names in this program are interesting. Neil Macneale being the first of those interesting names. And Neil Macneale is an interesting person. He was a civil engineer, and he was brought into the before he was brought into the company, and he had previous experience working with railroads down in the American South. And the most interesting story about Neil Macneale was that as the Civil War was starting to approach and several states were starting to secede from the Union, there were a bunch of safes that had been sold that had not been paid for already, that were down in the South. And Neil Macneale actually went down to the American South by rail, and he spoke to the governor of Tennessee and basically received a pass. So this pass basically said, although this guy is a northern businessman, we trust him, and he has the ability to move between seceded states. And Neil Macneale successfully recovered and basically repossessed all of the safes that had not been paid for in full by those who had purchased them down in the South. So in 1863, Urban's son actually buys into the company, and his name is Herman Urban. There's another one of those names. He had grown up working in the shop, and he came on as a 1/3 share partner. So we'll leave them there for a minute, and we'll step back again, and now we'll talk about another company. This is Diebold Baumann and Company. So Charles Carl Diebold, excuse me, he was born in 1824 in Bavaria, and he immigrated in 1847. and he partnered with a guy named Fred Baumann. Fred Baumann was born in Saxony, Germany in 1822. He actually served for 3 months in the Union Army at the very beginning of the American Civil War. And they started manufacturing safes in Cincinnati also. Again, they are very similar to this model 1849 that was basically being copied by all of these different companies at this point. So the interesting thing that happens is that they hired a bookkeeper who befriended Baumann and ended up being quite the businessman. And that bookkeeper was none other than Gustav Mosler. Mosler was born in 1816. He was an ethnic Jew from Silesia, which was part of Prussia at the time, was later part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and is currently part of Czechia. Before working for Diebold, he and 3 of his sons had actually run a cigar import business in Cincinnati. And in 1867, Mosler and Baumann actually split off from Diebold and started their own company, Mosler, Baumann and Company. And here's a couple examples of some of the safes that they have. This is actually a catalog that we have on file at the Cummins room of the Lane Library. You can see on the dial here, Mosler, Baumann and Company with all the patent dates. And again, some more of the examples of the safes that, that they built. Some advertising. And they made safes for some pretty notable people. However, they had some issues. Most of these issues came in the form of employment unrest. So in 1874, Gustav Mosler died, and his sons Moses, William, and Julius split off and formed their own company, Mosler Safe and Lock Company. So basically, they left Baumann behind. Baumann still operated the company as Mosler, Baumann and Company. So there, at one point in time, there were 2 different companies making safes that were called Mosler Safe Company in different forms. So we're talking about Mosler, Baumann and Company specifically right now. So they encounter these labor issues in the 1880s. Their problems were compounded in 1882 when workers were moving a safe into a client's house when they dropped it down a flight of stairs and it landed on the client's foot, and a lawsuit followed. In 1882 also, they were sued by shareholders of their company for not keeping good accounting, and ended up having to pay thousands of dollars back to the corporation. In 1886, their entire labor force demanded a 10% raise and more vacation time, and so on and so forth. And Baumann actually died of dropsy in 1889. There was an unsuccessful attempt to merge 11 local safe manufacturers into a larger company in 1893, but that did not end up coming to fruition. And basically in 1897, Mosler, Baumann and Company sold back to Mosler Safe and Lock Company, so the company run by the children of Gustav Mosler. So if we go back to Diebold for a second here. So what does Diebold do when Mosler and Baumann split off from his company? So he gets another partner named Jacob Kinzel, who was a former employee of theirs, who bought Baumann's shares in the company. And they basically started designing all kinds of different safes. By 1870, they had 67 different patterns for safes. But again, they are all pretty much variations of the concrete-lined Model 1849 safe. And in 1872, Diebold and Kinzel actually move out of Cincinnati and they head to Canton, Ohio. By that point in time, they had 250 employees, and 150 of them had actually relocated to Canton from Cincinnati. He had a new partner, John Norris, in 1874 to 1876. And here's a picture of them in Canton and some of their advertising and some of their products. And what is probably one of the best pieces of advertising I think I have seen. Even the devils can't break into the Diebold safe. And here's a picture of their plant up in Canton. And again, some of their products that have survived today. And they also manufactured vaults, such as this one. Okay, and that brings us to Victor Safe and Lock Company. Now, Victor Safe Company is not like all the rest of these companies. So it's started by a guy named Thomas Sawyer Spivey. And he, at the time, was a 26-year-old college-educated professional. And he had 4 years of business experience working with Mosler Safe Company. And he was actually their correspondent, or their PR person in today's context. But while in that position, he obsessively started studying safes and locks. And 3 years after leaving Mosler, he formed his own company, Victor Safe and Lock. And it was it was begun in 1885, incorporated in 1887. And while all of the other companies still manufactured safes that were related to the 1849 pattern and sued each other constantly over copyright infringement or patent infringement, Spivey took a different approach and he sought new ways to make improvements. So he's kind of our innovator of all of these different companies that are around. This included working with different types of metals and also creating different designs with an emphasis on quality and innovation. And he won several awards, specifically for the manganese steel cannonball safes that he produced. This eventually also grew to be one of the largest safe companies in the world, with about 20,000 safes being made annually. And here are some of their products. Here's a vault that they built, or one from a catalog, I believe, that they were selling. Here's one with the panels removed so you can see the interior of the doors. And here's one of their manganese steel cannonball safes. Okay, so we'll leave Spivey there for a while, and we'll come back now, and this is the beginning of the Hamilton safe industry. So we're going to pick back up with Macneale and Urban. So in 1867, Dodds retires, and the partners bought out his share, and the company becomes called Macneale Urban Safe Company. And they're still in Cincinnati at this point, but they also are starting to encounter several problems down in Cincinnati. In 1867 and 1871, there were major fires that destroyed part of their factory, but they still were continuing to do a pretty good business in sales. Here's their picture of their factory down in Cincinnati and some of the products while they were still based down in Cincinnati. And in 1888 is kind of when Hamilton enters the picture. The firm was seeking a new location. The reason was unknown, but it was probably related to the labor unrest that was going on at the time down there, as well as the fires and damage to their plant over the past couple decades. And they were approached by the Edgewood Finance Company. It was run by a guy named Lazard Kahn, who you see on the screen here. And Kahn we will talk about again in a little bit. He was probably the one single person who was most responsible for forming Hamilton's safe industry. He was the president or owner of the Estate Stove Company, is what it would later become called, in East Hamilton. And he partnered with several local businessmen to do these major industrial neighborhood developments. And the first of these partnerships was the Edgewood Finance Company that was created to build the Edgewood neighborhood on the west side of Hamilton, which is a very early suburb of Hamilton, previously Rossville on the west side. So the Edgewood Finance Company was looking for an anchor industry for this neighborhood. That's the way it used to be done. You'd have a major factory that was the employer, and then you had all the houses immediately adjacent to the factory, and inside that neighborhood were all your churches and your schoolhouse and everything that you would need for daily life was all right there. This is a time period before automobiles. People had to walk everywhere. So that's basically what he's working on doing. And he ends up entering into discussions with Macneale and Urban, and comes back to Hamilton, and his group raises $30,000 from the people of Hamilton of the $40,000 needed to move the factory to Hamilton. Yes. He got a whole bunch of people to donate money, even small amounts, to the point where he basically funded the 3/4 of their factory. And they, of course, took that and they moved up here. They built an 80,000 square foot factory that was built by the Bender Brothers Construction Company, which was one of the most notable construction companies of Hamilton's history. Work started in 1890, and by 1891, the company had manufactured the first 13 safes, I'm pretty sure. This is a picture of the factory building. You might recognize this building here. It's still standing. Millville Avenue in Edgewood. Yep. At its height, they had 600 employees and they were manufacturing about 60 safes per day. But the business kind of was already off to a rocky start before the move, and they were encountering financial difficulties from the get-go. And my feeling on this, I don't know for sure, is that it's just kind of maybe poor business practices and that kind of thing, that they're not operating as efficiently as they needed to be. And by 1894, they were actually considering moving back to Cincinnati. So, and here's some of the Hamilton-made Macneale and Urban products. There's an interior safe. And all these things are hand-painted, by the way. They would hire artists to do this. All of these safes are quality all the way. All right, we'll leave them there for a minute, and we'll come back to Moser. So, after breaking away from Bauman, Moses and William Moser took over. That's right, Moses Mosler, Mose Mosler, there's your other name. Down in Cincinnati, wait, hold on a second. I think that slide is put, there we go, Moses and William Moser. Their factory down in Cincinnati was also encountering problems. They actually relocated within Cincinnati 3 different times, and they had been flooded out at 2 of those locations by Ohio River floods. And so they're also looking for a place to relocate to. And who steps in? Lazard Kahn. This time, he's helping develop East Hamilton. So he was basically the person in charge of what came to be called the East Hamilton Improvement Syndicate. And this was a lot of influential manufacturers and bankers from Hamilton. And essentially what happened was all of East Hamilton, the entirety of it, was a planned development from the get-go. They sat down and mapped out exactly where and how to build all the neighborhoods and where to place all the industry. And they made a strip of industry between basically Hamilton and East Hamilton, where they could pull from the neighborhoods that were already developing in Hamilton, but also have, organic employment for all of the neighborhoods that they were building on the farm land that they purchased. So now he's undertaking this, and he basically ends up getting $85,000 in incentives for Moser to move to Hamilton. Yeah, this guy was a wheeler and a dealer from way back. So They divided the adjacent 30 acres of land into 240 residential lots. And they moved the factory up to a really, really advantageous location right between the Miami and Erie Canal and the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad. They basically are on either side of that strip of factories. Here's kind of this is actually a Sanborn map showing the original location of the factory. And here's the actual factory. The agreement was signed in 1890, but there were delays that followed, and the plant was not completed until September 21st of 1891. Production started the next month on October the 12th of 1891. And that's how Mosler Safe came to Hamilton. And here's some of their products. Of course, the Mosler safes. There's one in the back corner over there. And they also had a cannonball safe design that they made. And the same year that they came to Hamilton, in 1891, was also Hamilton's centennial. And they built the centennial safe, which you can see right here on this horse cart and also right there. It's pretty cool to be able to be in the room with it while I talk about this. And there's a picture that you don't need because it's right here. 4 years later, in 1895, they purchased the Corliss Safe Company of Providence, Rhode Island. And along with that, the patents for this gigantic round safe that they had, that you can see right here, the Corliss Cannonball Safe. And with that purchased, Mosler became the single largest safe manufacturer in the world. All right, let's go back to the Halls for a minute. So Joseph Lloyd Hall, who basically had built this company from the ground up with his father, he died in 1889. And he left the company to two of his sons and one of his son-in-laws, Edward and William Hall and Richard Pullen. And not long after this, there's a major consolidation that occurs that includes this company. There had been a safe company in New York City called Marvin Safe Company, and there had been a company that was partially in Philadelphia and partially in New York City that was called Herring and Farrell, and then another safe company in Philadelphia called Myers and Smith. And they all merged together to form Herring-Hall-Marvin Safe Company. So that's where all the names come from. Now they're still located down in Cincinnati at this time period. Here's a picture of that. But again, kind of like Macneale and Urban, they are operating at a loss for a little bit of time right after their consolidation. And they have another unique problem, and that is that all of the majority of the shareholders in the company are from all of those eastern safe companies. The majority of the profit is being made by Hall's company in Cincinnati. You now have within this one company a contingent of eastern interests and a contingent of western interests, and they are at odds with each other for the entirety of this company's existence. To the point, okay, well, first of all, back up a second. Almost got ahead of myself. Lazard Kahn once again steps in, this time with the backing of Oakey V. Parrish, who is a major banker in Hamilton's history, and, interestingly, Mose Mosler. And the three of them approach Herring-Hall-Marvin and basically talk them into relocating to Hamilton. And in fact, not only did they relocate to Hamilton, they relocated directly across the street from Mosler Safe Company. Now, why would they do that is the question, right? Why do you want your largest competitor right across the street from you? Because at some point, they had hoped that they could ditch the Eastern interests and merge Mosler and Herring-Hall-Marvin into one gigantic monopoly safe company. That never came to fruition. Instead, they just relocated their biggest rival right next door. So, Herring-Hall-Marvin's factory, it opens, excuse me, to a 100-gun salute for a groundbreaking ceremony on September the 1st of 1896. The plant had a floor space of 100,000 square feet. And it wasn't long after this that the conflicting interests who were on their board voted out the Hall family. Yeah, it still was a losing proposition. It's possible that because they had influenced the company to relocate to Hamilton and they were still not making a profit, that's why they were voted out. But interestingly, they left Pullen in to run the shop, and I think it's because he's the man with the technical know-how. So you can't vote him out or they don't know how to make safes anymore. So here's what the company looked like kind of at its full extent. I think this is actually a picture from about the 50s or 40s or so. And essentially, the company gets to a point where they're losing so much money that they try to appoint receivers. And I said receivers, plural. There's supposed to be one, right? The Eastern interests appointed a receiver, and the Western interests appointed a receiver. And then that had to go to court to figure out who was the real receiver. And the Eastern interests had beat the Western interests, so their guy was appointed first, so he was it at the end of the day. And eventually, they tried to reorganize the company. The reorganization effort fell apart. It was a big mess on the business end, right? Eventually, what happens is the creditors step in, and they make a deal where their creditors divide 25% of the cash that's on hand, and they get 75% interest divided amongst them of a new company to be formed. I should say a reorganization. It's the same company, but they're reorganizing it. And this happens in 1899. And throughout the process of this reorganization, they finally get the Eastern interests out. Which I should also note that in the meantime, they had the New York plant as well that was in operation. That was basically foreclosed at some point before this occurred. So now the Eastern interests didn't even have a factory, and now they're basically voted out of the company. So now we finally have Herring-Hall-Marvin that is solely locally or regionally owned, as opposed to being split between the two. And then one more thing, the Halls, when they got voted out, what do you think they did? They started their own safe company. And now we have Hall's Safe Company. Now, Herring-Hall-Marvin didn't like Hall's Safe Company, and they sued them and claimed that they shouldn't be allowed to use their own name for marketing. So a court eventually ruled in their favor, and Hall's Safe Company was allowed to remain named that as long as they didn't represent themselves as the old business, which I think was the claim. And Hall's Safe Company actually stayed in business from 1905 until 1928 before it went out of business and closed. All right, so to recap where we are in Hamilton with all that, from 1896 to 1907, that's when we received for the first time the title of Safe Capital of the World. We have 3 major safe manufacturers located in Hamilton: Herring-Hall-Marvin, Mosler, and Urban and Macneale, or Macneale and Urban, I should say. But soon after this, we lost one. Macneale and Urban Company, out of nowhere, was basically placed into voluntary receivership by the owners. And it had not been profitable, but it had been solvent. So it was kind of like they were making stuff at cost for a little bit of time. And it seems to be that there was a disagreement between Macneale and Urban, their descendants, who were the primary shareholders in the company. and they just chose to get rid of the company as opposed to try to work out whatever grievance there was. What that grievance was is lost to history. Don't know. But yeah, sure, it had something to do with that. It remained in receivership until 1907, and in 1907, Mosler Safe purchased it. And by that, they basically purchased the business, purchased the equipment, and sold off the building. So it's no longer its own independent factory anymore. Herring-Hall-Marvin, this is kind of the height of Herring-Hall-Marvin and Mosler. We're entering the height of their production, right? They became known for making high-quality safes and vaults and locks. They also emphasized taking care of their employees. They actually paid them for a 60-hour work week, but they only made them work 56 hours a week. There was a reorganization in 1905, and after they got rid of the Eastern interests and after they had reorganized the company, they started to prosper. And they actually were the first to manufacture safes that were safe against acetylene torches. That was their claim to fame as well. These pictures are really cool. These show the production floor, and if you'll notice, they have all these machines that are connected by belt shafts, and there's basically a giant coreless engine at this point in time that's turning a shaft that's running down the length of the factory, and then all these leather belts are connected to that turning shaft, and that's what turns the equipment that they're using. And here's some of the offices from that time, offices and then also the drafting. And just like to sprinkle in pictures of employees when I can. So you can see this is in front of a giant vault door that these guys manufactured. Moving in onto Mosler Safe, in this time period, 1917, they actually purchased Victor Safe Company. So Spivey's company, they became the owner of that. And here's some of their employees from the time period. It's also worth noting that a lot of these employees in all these safe companies were either German immigrants or they were migrants from Appalachia that worked here. I mean, almost universally, I would say, in some cases. Mosler also received a contract from the U.S. government to make gun carriages for World War I. This is a picture of a Mosler-built gun carriage. There's kind of the production floor. You can see a vault door on its side being worked on right here. There was a boom in business following World War I in the 1920s. There was all kinds of banks that were opening and stuff like that, and they were selling a lot of their materials. So this is a vault door. This one is actually located in Hamilton. This is in what's now the Benison. Yep, it used to be Home Building Savings and Loan Company and a few other banks. Yep. And this is a pretty cool picture, an 85-ton vault door going to a bank in Boston. And this picture right here, Grand Boulevard, Mosler, Herring-Hall-Marvin. In this one picture, you're looking at 50% of the world's safe production. One of every 2 safes made in the entire world came out of one of these 2 factories at this time period. So now I'm going to talk about some of the moments of truth, as we call them. So there's all kinds of stories from the great fires that happened, the 1871 Great Chicago Fire, the 1904 Baltimore Fire. And if you notice, these safes prove their worth in all these events. People are collecting them in that picture. There's an illustration of people digging them out from under rubble. The San Francisco earthquake. Again, another thing. This is a really cool picture. If you notice, Mosler Safe Company, they're hauling a safe out of a destroyed building. And then there's a picture of them opening the safe, and all the contents are intact inside. And they even got a little cocky about it and said, $1,000 reward to anybody who can prove that a safe was not or was destroyed in a fire or something like that. So the moments of truth, though, also extend to Hamilton. 1913, the flood. Now, Mosler's factory and property was actually not affected by the flood. It was the closest point to the floodwaters that was not inundated. And because of that, it basically transformed itself into a field hospital and a staging area for rescue operations and a collection point for flood survivors. There were three companies of the Ohio National Guard that showed up there and set up shop. There were police and fire units from Cincinnati that were sent up to help. They staged at Mosler's factory. And they basically just opened up their factory to allow that to happen, for that use, to look after the people of Hamilton that were in need at that time. Additionally, they were the only site in the city that maintained a telephone connection. Their telephone lines were not destroyed by the floods, so they were able to communicate out of the city to get help, which was another essential thing that happened. And here's just some pictures from the flood. You've probably seen these everywhere a million times, but just to show the devastation. Then we have the Great Depression. In 1933, Mosler only did 2 bank jobs the entire year. It was a bad year for them. And one of them was for a bank in Japan and the other was for a bank in China. So they weren't even local or in the United States or anything like that. They experienced, banks were very hard hit by the Great Depression. Every time you talk about it, you hear about banks closing, going out of business and things like that. There was no FDIC at that point in time, right? So if the banks are closed, there's no need to secure the money. If there's no need to secure the money, there's no need for the safes. Safe industry suffers. Business started to pick up again around 1935 or 1936, but like everywhere else, it wouldn't really recover until World War II came along, right? However, Mosler got one contract that basically kept it afloat through the Great Depression. And that was the bank, right? They got the contract to build the Fort Knox Gold Depository Vault in 1936. So located down in Kentucky at Fort Knox. It's, 80% of the world's monetary gold is what it protected. And they built the vault for it. So I believe even to this day, unless there's something we don't know, the vault door that Mosler built is still installed in this building. And there was one video that exists of a visit where they kind of did some filming and showed it. And this is some of the images from that. But that's the door to the vault on the inside of the gold depository. And these are pictures of people who are unlocking it. So, okay, World War II comes along. The defense contracts come back. Unlike World War I, with World War II, every company that could make something for the war effort made something for the war effort, right? Herring-Hall-Marvin retooled to do defense work, and they made gun mounts for U.S. Navy weapons. So they didn't make the actual gun, but they built the mount that attached the gun to the ship, mostly for anti-aircraft weapons, I believe. Mosler Safe Company, they built blower housings for LSTs, which is land-to-ship tank that you see right here. They also built turrets for M4 Sherman tanks. So they didn't build the guns again, but they built the turret that was mounted onto it. And there's a couple interesting stories of Mosler that I actually got from Jim Blount originally. There was from both companies. There was a Herring-Hall-Marvin manager who had been a naval officer in World War I. And In the middle of the night, there was a knock on his door, and when he answered it, there was a Navy officer there who said that he had been recalled to service, and he was being stationed at Herring-Hall-Marvin to oversee the production of the anti-aircraft gun mounts. There was a Mosler employee who actually tried to enlist and was denied the ability to enlist for no reason. He went to work the next day, and there was an Army intelligence officer inside the office and said, "Do you still want to enlist?" And when he said yes, he said, "Okay, pack your bags and come with me." And he ended up being put in a unit of safe crackers that went around Europe opening safes. Both of these companies had a role in the Manhattan Project, believe it or not. Herring-Hall-Marvin machined uranium that was used in the atomic weapons. So they took the raw uranium and they turned it into the shape that it needed to be used in the weapons. You know all about that, don't you? Yep. Mosler Safe Company actually partnered with Armco in Middletown to build cyclotrons, which are atom smashers or particle accelerators that are used in physics experiments. Essentially, they're huge magnets. Don't ask me how they work. I cannot tell you. But they were essential. Here's a picture of one. They were essential to the research that was being done that led to the technology that enabled the creation of the atomic weapons. Mosler has one other unique claim to fame. They were actually on both sides of the bombing in Hiroshima. They had created the cyclotron to help create the atomic bomb. They also had installed a vault in a bank in Hiroshima. This is the bank before and after the bombing. And this is their vault before and after the bombing. It was intact. It was about the only thing that was left standing. Now, moving into the post-war or Cold War period, there is probably not a better credential that Mosler could have for government contracts than to say that our vault is the only one ever that has been proven to withstand a nuclear blast. Here come the government contracts, right? So to start with, I'm actually going to go back to Herring-Hall-Marvin for a second. They continued machining uranium for use in nuclear, both experiments and power plants. They were subcontracted through North American Aviation and DuPont and a few other companies. And Mosler actually went to work for the Atomic Energy Commission, conducting tests and building vaults that were involving nuclear tests and that kind of thing. Mosler also moved into the security business. So this is the first move into the security business. This ends up not being a good move for them in the long run, but in the short term, they're successful. And a bug detection device that they built actually in 1951 was used to find a bug that was put inside a wooden seal given by the Soviets to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And this is a picture of someone who's not too happy, politician pointing to where the bug was located inside that wooden seal. And I've heard people talk about the Greenbrier. We know about this. Yeah. They received the contract for the Greenbrier Hotel. This is the vault door that they built for that. And what this is, it's now common knowledge, but at the time it was top secret. This was a bunker that was supposed to be where the United States government would assemble in the event of nuclear war. So this vault door kept the United States running, essentially. The seat of government was supposed to move to here. And you can see this is the interior of it. In addition to that, they also got contracts to house the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Here is actually a picture of somebody installing the Declaration of Independence into, it's a jack-in-the-box type vault. That thing right there is a example, a model of it. It doesn't show well on my screen, but it basically lifts it into a display, and then it lifts it down into a vault where it's secure. Now, throughout this time period, they also continued just making safes, both companies, and their banking equipment and that kind of line. Believe it or not, there was a huge increase in bank robberies in the 1950s. From 1950 to 1957, a congressional study found that there was a 300% increase in bank robberies. Hold on. This included locally. This is a picture from the Hamilton Journal-News that talks about a safe-cracking gang nabbed. And when I saw this picture, the first thing I thought of was The Usual Suspects, if anybody's seen that. There was actually a famed bank robber named Willie Sutton, and he was once quoted as saying, "My heart sank when I saw it was a Mosler safe. Those Mosler people can certainly make safes." There was also an unknown burglar who once left a message typed out on a typewriter at a Montgomery ward, and the message basically congratulated them on purchasing a Mosler that he couldn't break into it. So these are some of the safes through this time period that are being made. They look a little different. They're a little more modern looking, if you will. The artwork is gone. But there was actually a proliferation in the amount of safes and bank equipment that they were selling in this time period because of suburbanization, right? Everywhere where the suburbs are popping up, a branch bank pops up somewhere nearby. And all these branch banks need their own vaults and security equipment and everything else. And then there's actually an act, the Bank Protection Act, that required all federally insured banks to have proper protective equipment, and that passed in 1968. So that was also a major driver for their sales. As well as drive-up windows, the automobile comes of age, and everything starts gearing toward that. And Herring-Hall-Marvin, there's a major move that happens with that in 1959. Diebold purchases it. So remember Diebold from the very beginning that moved to Canton. They come back to Hamilton in 1959 and purchase Diebold. But the government says that that's a violation of antitrust laws and that they're trying to form a monopoly on that. So basically, at the end of the day, and I only learned about this from talking to Hubert Mallicote, he said that he worked in the plant for many years. He said that basically Diebold people came in and stripped the buildings of everything and took the equipment and all their products and everything and put it in other facilities that Diebold owned. And when the government inspectors came in to look, there was nothing there of any value besides the buildings. So they allowed for the purchase to go through. They retooled the factory to start manufacturing secure filing cabinets. This is actually one in the basement of the library building. I moved that. I don't ever want to do that again. Yeah. And here's Herring-Hall-Marvin's plant from around this time period. So both of these companies also went public. Mosler did in 1962 and Diebold did in 1964. Mosler was actually purchased by American Standard Company in 1967. So this is the first time it leaves family ownership, basically. And they basically shift to all of this banking equipment. So they're moving away from the vaults and the safes and stuff like that, and they're moving towards all of this other secure banking stuff. So here's some of their catalogs from the time period. I thought this thing was particularly cool. It's called a snorkel. So basically, somebody drives up to it, and there's a series of mirrors, and the person can do the banking through like some kind of system that's built into it from underground. And then as the computer age begins to dawn, they start switching to ATM manufacturing. That's the new thing. Diebold has something called the Futura ATM, and the Tellermatic is what Moser's product is. However, both companies did not do well in that market. And the reason is that they were competing against computer companies like IBM. So they're trying to approach this from a hardware perspective, thinking they have the right answer, when really the software companies are the ones that have the right answer with this. And then the last new company we'll talk about is Hamilton Safe. So Hamilton Safe Company was started by two guys. One of them was Harvey Hinkle. He actually worked at Herring-Hall-Marvin Safe starting in 1920. And he ended up as the vice president of manufacturing. And after the acquisition by Diebold, he retired. And then in 1967, he came out of retirement and he partnered with a guy named Robert C. Red DeLuce, and they formed Hamilton Safe Company in 1967. And although it's called Hamilton Safe Company, it was located in Fairfield, actually, on Production Drive, out there past Jungle Gyms off Route 4. And this grew into an international company. They were also pretty successful, had a wide range of products, and they had a whole lot of subsidiary companies as well. One of them was Hamilton Air. And the next time you go through a bank drive-through, look at the tube that you put your little check in. That's probably made by Hamilton Air, or was at least originally. They also moved into physical security and stuff like that, and they ended up merging in 2012 with a company called Ganebo Group, which is out of Sweden, I believe. So, we're getting on toward the end here. So, American Standard, at the time that they had purchased Mosler, they were looking to become like this international conglomerate company. And that never came quite to fruition. And in 1986, Mosler Inc. was formed out of the company. It was a buyout by employees. So now the employees are running it, as well as a New York investment bank called Kelso and Company. And there was an economic downturn in the 1980s that caused a lot of small banks to close. That hurt their business. They were not near the powerhouse that they once were, Mosler Safe Company. And these are some of the products they were making around that time. There's American Standard. Oh, too far. In 1996, on April 2nd, production finally ended at Mosler. And that was after 104 years at their plant in Hamilton. Now, in October of 1990, Diebold had also announced that they would be closing slowly. There were actually investigations held there in 1988, 89, and 93 by the Department of Energy related to their machining of the uranium that was done there. And they found that it actually was a contaminated site, and there were EPA cleanup operations that occurred there. And that's what Herring-Hall-Marvin looked like around the end there. There's Mosler's closure. Mosler basically finally just went bankrupt. They filed for bankruptcy on August 6th of 2001, and they had actually closed their offices 3 days before that. And from my understanding, they didn't tell any of their employees ahead of time. Their employees showed up to work and then were all basically laid off immediately. They had a headquarters on Burke Boulevard, which is now Bilstein Boulevard. And they actually sold that to Diebold. And a couple years later, Diebold opened a service center there. So we're not manufacturing safes anymore, but we're servicing all the old safes that had been manufactured for a little bit of time still. And basically, at the end of the day, Diebold purchased all of the what was left of Mosler Safe Company. So Diebold ends up the only company out of all of these companies we've talked about at the end of the day. They demolished both sites. Excuse me. The Mosler building was torn down between 2003 and 2004, and Kroger was built on the site in East Hamilton. Diebold's factory was torn down 2012 to 13, and very recently, actually, the YWCA has opened their new headquarters on that site. Diebold itself ended up being acquired by Nixdorf Company, which was a German computer company. So now it's Diebold Nixdorf, and that is actually still in existence, and it's headquartered in North Canton, Ohio. So this is one of two companies at the end of the day that are still in operation. The other one is Hamilton Safe. Hamilton Safe Company, after being acquired by Ganebo, consolidated a bunch of different locations around the tri-state into one location in Milford Township. Or not Milford Township, I'm sorry, Milford, Ohio. I misspoke. Yeah, so their facility is down there. They actually have two companies, Hamilton by Ganebo, and then also Hamilton Products Company is actually their Department of Defense contracts company. So those are still in operation as well. And Ganebo Group is actually one of the leading safe manufacturers in the world still today, though it's not the market that it once was. So that is the story of how Hamilton became the safe capital of the world, and I'll take any questions you might have, and thank you for listening to me. Yes?
How does Spivey's company become the good company?
He picked that name. Yep, that's all I can tell you. I don't know why he picked it, but anybody else? Okay, well, I'll be around for questions too if anybody has any. Thank you. Thank you.